Hello, everyone. I did my topic on interviews for this week. So, how would I describe this data? And actually, in the Mertler text on page 108, they did a really good job of explaining what an interview is. So, an interview is or are conversations between the teacher and the researcher and the participants in the study in which the teacher poses questions to the participant. And the great thing about interviews are there's many different ways to do this. There are some unique processes and procedures to the technique. So, for example, one of the things I found was that you can actually use email interviews, and a lot of times people prefer this because they're more willing to give you true and accurate data if they're not face to face with you. So that was something unique. There's also different formatting allowed, and there's different types of questioning and probing. So we'll go over the formats on the next slide, but some types of interviews allow you to kind of dig deeper, and if the person says something, then you can ask them more questions about that. So it's really great that you can find out so much useful information. And then there's also focus groups, which are a certain type of interview. They're usually small groups, around 10 to 12, the Mertler text said. And the great thing about this is that usually people are more willing to share in a small group versus if it's just a one-on-one interview. However, it did say you need to be careful, and I'll talk about the reason why in the concerns slide. So this is qualitative data, and that is how Mertler described it. And then we're going to go over some different types of questions that you can use for this technique. So there's a structured interview, and this is when the researcher starts with a guide of specific predetermined questions, and they don't shy away from this guide. So they only ask the questions on the guide that they came up with before the interview. And the reason for this is for consistency. So that way that their data is valid and it's consistent throughout every person they interview. So that's the first type. Then there is a semi-structured interview, and this is when they have base questions. So typically maybe 3 to 4 base questions, and these would be questions that you come up with before the interview, but you could also follow up with more specific questions then based on how that person answered. So that would be the semi-structured. And then there's the open-ended interviews, and this is the least structured, but it's when there's a few questions very broad in nature. So typically no yes or no answers. One of the examples in the book were like, how do you feel about your school? Something like that that's open-ended, so the person couldn't just respond as yes or no. And again, this would be like a very opinionated response from that person. So it'd be interesting to take into consideration. So there are definitely strengths and weaknesses with this type of data collection, and Mertler really described these well. But some of the strengths is that you can really probe for further questions and ask for clarification. So not necessarily with that structured interview we talked about, but with the semi-structure and the open-ended, you can really probe for clarification. So if you're not understanding what they're talking about, that's a great thing you can do. The data can be preserved through video and audio tape, so you have it forever. If you forget what they said or you need to go back at any point in your research, it's always there, so you don't lose it, which is also great. And conversations can also be more appealing to people than writing. Sometimes people would rather talk it out than write about it, so you might be able to get more from them if they're speaking to you versus them taking a survey. Some of the weaknesses, though, however, are that they're very, very time consuming. Every interview that you take would have to be transcribed, meaning that you would then have to write what the person said and what you said. So everything would have to be transcribed. And they said that this can take hours to do. So very time consuming. Something else are that the responders are typically not anonymous. If it's an interview, you can hear their voice. And sometimes this shies people away from really using this technique. And they also people can fear that answers may be used against them. So if you're doing a face-to-face interview, they may not always be upfront with you because they don't want you to judge them, or they don't want you to then predetermine something based on their answer. So that's another weakness to the interview. And then last but not least, concern-wise, The biggest concern I see with interviews are that I personally feel people may be less likely to tell the truth during a face-to-face interview. I think it's easier over writing, at least for me personally, to be honest and upfront. And I think face-to-face, sometimes people will not be as honest, and that might affect the validity and reliability of your data. So I think that's something you want to be careful with. Also, going back to the focus group, one of the concerns with that is that one or two people may dominate the discussion. So if you have a small group of 10 to 12, but only two people are voicing their opinions, that's also going to affect the validity of your research. So I think that that is something to keep in mind. Overall, I think interviews are great qualitative data when they're used properly and effectively. So hopefully this can help some of you who are using and planning to use interviews for your research. So good luck, everybody.